UFOs, nuclear missiles, and a 20-year-old kid alone in the fog at 2 in the morning.
It's foggy. It's very foggy. There's a large stadium-type light over the missile site to light it up. So the figure started walking towards me, and I realized there was something wrong here. I backed into the guard shack, felt like a trapped animal, like a rat trapped in a corner.
And when he woke up, he wasn't on the ground anymore.
I'm inside this circular room. I'm on my knees and looking out that window.
And before they brought him back, they had a message.
We're not going to allow you to go to nuclear war, but if we have to intervene, he says, then it's between us who's going to get the spoils.
So what really happened at Vandenberg Air Force Base in September of 1964? Let's find out. Hey everyone, I'm Matt Ford, and welcome to the Good Trouble Show. Tonight, we have two very special guests. On your left is a man whose story Robert Hastings considers one of the most remarkable he has ever documented. In September of 1964, Richard Barth was a 20-year-old Air Force security guard stationed at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, the epicenter of American nuclear missile testing. What happened to Richard on a foggy night that September has stayed with him for over 60 years. Richard, thank you for being here and for your courage in telling this story. Now, on your right is a man who needs no introduction to our audience. Robert Hastings is the author of UFOs and Nukes, Extraordinary Encounters at Nuclear Weapon Sites. He has interviewed over 200 former Air Force personnel about UAP incursions at nuclear weapons facilities, and he has been a friend and guide to this show since our very first conversation on this topic. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. So Robert, you have spent decades collecting testimony from Air Force personnel about UAP incursions at nuclear weapon sites. I think it's over 200 witnesses or even more than that now?
I'm sure I've spoken to several hundred, but the core of the interviewees, I number 169, Richard being the 169th. But yes, many Air Force veterans who were involved in nuclear weapons-related UFO incidents. I began in 1973, and about 5 or 6 years ago, because of advancing age and some health issues, I really got out of the investigations business, so to speak. But recently I've been approached by 3 individuals, including Richard, who have amazing stories that really need to be followed up on and equally important, need to be publicized. I think Richard's story is quite dramatic and very integral to what I've done for all these years.
I absolutely agree. And again, so happy to have you back on the show. You've been such a great friend to me and especially to the show and the people that you've brought along on what I think is one of the most important elements of the whole UAP discussion is the tie to nuclear weapons. So Richard, welcome to the show, and super glad to have you on. Walk us through how you ended up at Vandenberg Air Force Base in 1964. I understand you were a young man in Los Angeles. How does someone end up starting off in LA and ending up guarding various missiles at an Air Force base?
Well, I was a student at Pasadena City College on a pre-med major, but my grades weren't very good, and I graduated with a C average. And back in those days, if you didn't have a B+ average, you weren't even going to transfer to a university level. So I decided to join the Air Force, and as a medic, actually. And he said, well, you have a 2-year college degree. You know, we have a program here. We're going to train some undergraduate navigators, and would you be interested in that? Well, I was really interested in that because I had been in Civil Air Patrol and very interested in flying. So he said, well, go down and take the test and we'll go from there. So they sent me down to LA. It was an all-day test. It covered everything from psychological to spatial relationships to map reading it's just very extensive, and I passed that. So after that, they sent me for the flight physical, which is very extensive. I passed that. And he says, well, you're in, we just need to have a class for you. That took a couple of months to have an opening in the class. And that came, and I went to James Connolly Air Force Base in Texas and was an aviation cadet for navigation. Unfortunately, when we got to the celestial navigation part, I was starting to have difficulty. I was transposing a lot of numbers. They give you 2 chances to pass your flight test, and I failed both of those. So basically, I washed out. And when I joined, I was under selective service. I joined under selective service. That was a enticement to go for this program. So I had to serve a total of 2 years plus reserve time. Well, in cadets, I had served 11 months before I washed out. So I had 13 months left. That was not a lot of time for training into a particular field. So they said, you can choose your base where you'd like to go. So I chose Vandenberg Air Force Base primarily because it was close to my home, about a 4-hour drive, and I can take my time off and go home and be with my friends was the incentive to go there.
I would imagine with today's traffic in LA, that 4-hour drive would probably be more like a 6-hour drive.
Yeah, sure it would be, yeah. But
So
then
Richard,
it wasn't.
go ahead, sorry.
Back then it wasn't that bad. It was.
Yeah. It's, I hate LA traffic. So Richard, describe Vandenberg for our audience. Paint a picture of what this place actually was like in 1964, what you were guarding, and what was the scale of what they were doing. Let's say that I have no idea what happens at Vandenberg.
Well, Vandenberg had originally been an Army base in the 1960s. It was converted, it was transferred over to the Air Force and became a missile base, and primarily what they did was test missiles. And then they did some satellite launches. The spy satellites were coming into vogue back then. And we had a lot of like the Thor missiles. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, we took the Thor missiles out of Turkey and we sent them all to Vandenberg, and they were ideal for launching satellites because they were intermediate range. They weren't ICBMs, but they could get a satellite into the low orbit where they wanted them, and that was 100 miles, 150 miles or so. But we also had other missiles that we were testing. The Atlas missile, which they used for the Gemini program, and that's what John Glenn flew up on. That was an outdated ICBM. But it had a lot of uses for the heavier satellite launches and some testing. We could test warhead re-entries. I don't know. I'm sure you know Robert Jacobs. That was an Atlas missile that he was following, and that was to test the warhead itself. And then we had Titans, which for the current ICBM, the advantage of the Titan, it was solid fuel, or not solid fuel, it was liquid fuel, but it was room temperature, so you could start in the silo without having to fuel it just before launch, so it could be launched immediately. And then, of course, the Minuteman, which was our frontline ICBM, it was solid fuel. It could launch straight out of the silo at about a 5,000-mile range, and we haven't changed it that much. We're still using basically the same missile right now. The missiles were never armed, mostly because Vandenberg was very vulnerable. You can drop a bomb in the bay on the ocean, just create a tsunami and take the base out. But it was excellent for testing because it was on the ocean. You can launch over the ocean down the Pacific test range. And so it was ideal for testing and north-south satellite launches, which put an advantage over Cape Canaveral because they did east-west, we did north-south. And that gave us more coverage of the Soviet Union.
So, Richard, this sounds like this this Air Force Base, Vandenberg, strategically was very important to the United States of America.
Oh, absolutely. Almost anything that we put out actively first was tested at Vandenberg in terms of missiles.
Now, tell us about the night shift at a Minuteman missile site. So you spoke about the older missiles, so now we're talking Minuteman, because I think people kind of sort of think of a facility like that as kind of like a high alert, dramatic situation, but from what I understand, it was actually quite different when you were there on guard.
No, it was not very high alert. There was in certain areas, but it wasn't particularly on most of the missile sites. And they would put a single guard on each of the sites. If it was high alert, you'd have double guards, one man to watch the other. Everything was double man policy. But Vandenberg, or the Minuteman site, was basically just one man on the missile site. Vandenberg was very stretched along the coast between Point Sal and Point Aguilo. So there's about a 20-mile stretch that base covers. The Minutemen were all the way to the north by Point Sal, the last of the silos. They were right on the ocean. We had about 10 missile sites there, and a launch center, so that there would be one guard on each missile. We split our shifts so that you did 3 swings, 3 nights, 3 days, 3 off. So we weren't always on the night shift. But being on the ocean at night, it was often very cold, often foggy. And you're about quarter of a mile, half a mile from the next silo. So you're really out there in the middle of nowhere. And that was not considered cushy duty by any of us, and we didn't like to get out there.
It doesn't sound like it. So at the beginning of your shift, would everybody just load up in a pickup truck and they would just drop everyone off at their guard shack?
Yeah, we had a guard mount. Then we had 4 squadrons, 3 squadrons on duty and 1 squadron off at the time, and they covered the different swings, nights, and days. And so I was on nights. We'd have guard mount, then we'd load our weapons, and then we'd get on the pickup truck and we'd go out to our sites. Mostly we carried 38s. We qualified in M1 carbines, which weighed 10 tons after an hour slinging that on your shoulder. But so we all went and qualified for 38 police specials.
But so what, while you're on duty, it's not like people are driving by all the time. You're just kind of dropped off and you're alone for most of the evening?
Not on the night shift. About the only one you're going to see the whole night is your sergeant will drop by and give you your box lunch and then take off, and you won't see him till morning when they pick you up.
Wow, I don't think I would have lasted in that job. I would have fallen asleep on duty. So let's jump to September of 1964. Walk us through that night as slowly as you can, what you saw, what you thought, and when you realized this was not what you initially assumed it was.
Well, it was a foggy night, which is not atypical. The launch sites, we had a little guard shack in front of a fence that actually guarded missile, had ADT alarm system, and so nobody was really going to get in there without triggering the alarm. But they had us sitting at the gate, the entrance gate, and kind of a broken down old guard shack. It was. And most of it didn't even have electricity in, but we did have a telephone in there. So technically, we were supposed to make a call every half hour to command post, but it was very boring, and command post was bored, and we didn't make those calls usually. We just, if anything, just to keep awake, we would call each other's post and try to keep awake. So between the guards, we didn't really understand why we were even out there, because it was. If they had a missile that was ready to fire or arm, they didn't even put a guard on it. So, but they did. So, and I think they were just copying what was going on in Malmstrom or something. So it's foggy. It's very foggy. There's a large stadium-type light over the missile site to light it up, and that created what was like a dome from where I was sitting in the guard shack. I can see probably 30 yards in front of me, and naturally the missile site behind me was lit up. So the sergeant had just come by, given me my box lunch, which would have been roughly 2:00 in the morning. And he just left. And so I'm sitting there, and I ate my lunch, and then I have nothing to do. So I'm sitting there, and I could see this figure in the fog in front of me about 30 yards away, which looked like, and it was coming out of the fog. And I thought, well, the sergeant came back, but why would he walk back? Why didn't he drive back? Because the missile was about 100 yards off the road, and there's a little entrance road that came from the main road to the missile. So I didn't see why he just didn't drive down like he did when he delivered the box lunch.
Are you hearing like footsteps? Like what sort of caught your attention?
I could just see this shadow. That's basically, it's a shadow, and it was wearing like a trench coat or similar to the raincoats that officers had. And he had a garrison type cap on. So I just figured, well, that's not a sergeant. So I wonder if one of the officers is just checking up on us. And because there was some morale issues out there. And so the figure started walking towards me, and I realized there was something wrong here. And I kind of felt that I felt its presence. It was not like it was just there, but I felt it inside of me. And I got scared, and I was going to pull my gun, and my right arm was literally paralyzed. I couldn't even move my right arm to pull my weapon. And the figure just kept coming at me. And then I became terrified. And so I backed into the guard shack, and at the back, we had a little shelf where they had the telephone. And I backed into that, and I remember literally trying to push the back wall out to get out. I felt like a trapped animal, like a rat trapped in a corner. And when the figure came towards me, it had normal humanoid features and height, but I cannot remember the face. There was something about that face that terrified me. But if my brain just won't take it. I see a blank when I can't see that face even now. But whatever, it terrified me. And the next thing I knew, I just passed out. I was out.
You sensed that something was wrong about him as he was approaching. Was this something you picked up on before you sort of felt his presence in your mind? Was it maybe his gait or some kind of visual signal?
He was controlling me. He obviously controlled my right arm, and I felt like he had control of me. It's hard to explain, but I just didn't feel that. I just felt he was a threat, that he obviously paralyzed my right arm. I couldn't pull my weapon. I felt like he's just inside my head, and probably was. He was controlling me. He had to be inside my head somehow, telepathically.
Did that feeling intensify as he got closer? And do you recall trying to fight the sensation?
I was just pure terror. I couldn't describe what the terror was like, other than to say my analogy to a rat trapped in a corner from the cat. You can't get out of where you're going, and there's nowhere to go. There's the fight and flight response. Can't fight, and you can't flee. So it was terrible. It was just pure terror. That's all I can say. And enough that I passed out.
Do you recall thinking at all that this was something not from here, or did your mind even have the time to?
I didn't have time for that. I was just terrorized. That's all I could tell. I was so terrorized that I just went blank. I remember trying to push the back out of the guard shack, and I remember that shelf digging into my back, and then I just go blank.
Do you recall this being saying anything to you as you're approaching?
No, it it wasn't really communicating with me, with this being, when it came towards me. It just had control of me. That's all I could say.
So you pass out, and the next thing you know, you're somewhere else entirely. Tell us where you are and what you see when you sort of come to.
Okay, now the next thing I know, I'm inside this circular room, probably 15 feet across, 10 feet, 15. I'm not real good at judging distance. And I'm on my knees. The floor is kind of concave, and there's about a 3 foot, 3.5 foot circular, like a window right in the middle of the floor. And I'm leaning and looking out that window, and all I can see is fog, basically. And I'm aware of the presence of this entity on my right. And now the communication is, and it's telepathic. Don't look over at me. Just keep looking out the hole. And it looked like a hole. It didn't look like it was covered with glass or anything. But one thing I did notice, I expected some cold air to be coming through or something, and it wasn't. So there was a barrier, some sort of barrier between myself and the outside. I'm not even sure it was a project. It could have been a projection for all I know, but it looked just like a round window that you're looking through, and there you could just see the fog. That was it. And the entity to my right saying, "Just keep looking out the window. Don't look in my direction."
Did you sense any sort of vibration, motion, altitude, or anything that would have maybe given you a clue as to where you were in space?
Not right away. But as I'm looking out this window, the fog began to separate, and I'm looking down. Now I'm about 150 feet up. Again, I'm not that great at judging distances, but I'm on a post that's down the road about a quarter of a mile across the street. It was designated D11. I knew all the posts because I'd guarded all of them. And the light is just starting to get light. It's like early dawn. And and I'm looking straight down, and this flatbed Air Force type truck pulls up. It's loaded with pipes. And then the guard comes out of his shack, and he's on the right side of the truck. He goes over to the window, I assume to check ID. He opens the gate, lets the truck in. He goes back in his shack, and the fog closes in. So now I'm just still looking down this hole and it's foggy again. And the entity says, "Now don't look at me." But I was curious where I was, and I kind of raised my eyes to the top of my head, and then I could see across this round room, and there were about 10 feet away from me, maybe a little less, there were 4 figures sitting down there, and they were small humanoid figures, but disproportionate. They had large heads, and probably, it's hard, they were sitting, so I'm going to guess right around 4 feet tall or something like that. The room itself was, the light that came in there outside of what made it come up through that hole was backlit. And I'm assuming that was from the wall, because it was the common texture light. Dark and gray is what it was. And so the figures were kind of silhouetted. There's enough that I can kind of make out some of their features, which was primarily the large eyes. And it was a round head. It didn't have the pointed chin like you see on some of the picture, but it looked like a baby, a newborn baby. It was proportionately like a newborn baby, except it was no hair, no ears, large eyes, and from what I can make out, very small nose and mouth, but not real clear. It's more like silhouetted figures, just barely visible. And they just sat there. They didn't do anything. They just sat there. They were between the figures are 2 and 2, and between them was a little gap. I assume might have been a door or something to the room, because I felt like I was in a room inside something larger. And so at that point, the that's the end of that. Next thing I know, I'm back in the guard shack, except I'm on the floor on my back with my head on an entity's lap. And now the entity is communicating with me and it's basically apologizing that it had scared me so badly. And it kind of said, but we needed to get some information from the missile site. Now, how they got that, I don't know. How they got past the ADT and into the computer section, I don't know. But that was what they were after, apparently.
I want to jump back to when you were in the ship. So when you look at the four figures, did any of them react to you being observed?
No, they just sat there. You could tell their posture. Their hands were on their knees, and they just sat there and like they were observing me, but not interacting at all.
So you come to inside this craft. Was there any noise? Did you smell anything in particular?
No, it was quiet. I expected it would be cold from the hole in what appeared to be a hole in the floor, but it was quite comfortable. Actually, I was, my observation was that it was comfortable, and I wondered why, because that hole it didn't look like it was covered with glass. It just looked like a hole, but the one thing I noticed, there was no embarkation between the room itself. Looked like it was molded, and the bench that they sat on was just an extension of the wall that was behind them, and the floor is just like it was molded, and there was no real embarkation between the circle, the clear circle, and the floor. It didn't look like there was a joint or anything like that. It looked like it was all the same material, except for the circle was clear and the rest of it was dark gray. And my impression was that because I knew I had been so scared, I could remember what had happened, but I felt very calm. Like, I don't know if in the interim, they had sedated me or somehow I just felt very calm. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't afraid of the figures. I was just very calm. Now I'm just kind of curious of what's going on here. I have no idea why they showed me Site D11 other than they wanted me to see it, maybe just show where I was or something. So,
do you think that calm was something you arrived at naturally, or do you think it could have been induced?
I think it was induced. If you go from that degree of terror to, you don't do that. I mean, that was... I was terrorized. The next thing I wake up, at the point I black out, and then I wake up and I feel calm. The only thing I'm totally aware of is a figure to my right saying, "Don't look over at me," and just keep looking through the hole.
Do you think the figure on the right was the same being that approached you on the ground?
I think so. I mean, I couldn't look, so I couldn't. But sure. I felt like it was the same thing, yeah.
While you're on the ship, do you recall how it felt? And what I mean by that, did it feel like you were in any sort of dream state or as real as you and I talking right now?
Just like now, just very conscious, very awake. Very curious to what's going on here. Even when I saw the figures, they didn't scare me. They just looked at me, and I must have been sedated, because I didn't really have much reaction to what was going on, but I was aware of what was going on.
So it wasn't like sedated, like when you go to the doctor to have some procedure done and you feel a little high.
No. I just felt okay. I just felt normal. I felt at ease. The best way to put it, I just felt at ease. I wasn't scared. I just felt at ease. That's all I could say. And a little curious as to why he wouldn't let me look at him. I was a little nervous about this figure on my right. But I wasn't going to look at him because he kept communicating, "Don't look at me." But I wasn't threatened by him either. It's just.
And while your head is in this being's lap, do you recall what that physical contact felt like? Was there warmth, a texture?
Oh, yeah, it was warmth. I mean, I could feel that I was in his lap. The legs and that. It's like laying down in somebody's lap on their legs. I'm on my back. I had my eyes tightly shut. And again, this telepathic message, don't open your eyes, keep your eyes shut. And then again, it was almost to the other extreme. He was apologizing for, and I call him he, because originally my impression was it was male. And I just felt wonderful, really. It wasn't just at ease. Now I felt really, really good. The only thing I could describe it is I felt like a baby would feel when it's suckling at its mother's breast. It just feels like almost a euphoric type feeling that I was feeling at the time.
And it apologizes for scaring you. And then what else does it communicate?
It communicated that it was necessary that they get some data out of the missile silo. And basically that they couldn't allow us to go to nuclear war, and that it was necessary for them to find a way to stop us from launching these missiles. And so he explained why they were there, but he also said one other thing, or communicated one other thing. He says, you're very lucky. We're very benevolent. He says, but we're not all benevolent. So that suggested that there's more than other people out there. And he said, we're not going to allow you to go to nuclear war, but if we have to intervene, he says, then it's between us who's going to get the spoils. So that gave me the impression that between them, they didn't get along all that well. They had some sort of agreement that unless we launched these missiles, that they weren't going to do or intervene. But that didn't sound like they all got along to me.
Now, here's what I keep coming back to in my head. So they didn't leave you unconscious on the ground. They come in, or this being comes in, you're in the guard shack and you pass out. But as opposed to sort of leaving you there, because at that point you're incapacitated, you're not going to be interfering with whatever they're trying to do at the launch facility. They take you aboard that craft. And again, they could have simply incapacitated you and just, kind of gone about their business. Do you think you went from being an obstacle to being an opportunity?
I don't know. Sometimes I look back at it and I wondered if I've heard of people dying or, from fear. And, the possibility, I went into cardiac arrest and they had to revive me. That may be the reason they took me aboard the craft, but I don't know. That's just speculation. All I know is that I went from the guard shack to the craft and then back to the guard shack. The guard shack was on the floor. And I wasn't incapacitated at that time, other than I was just communicated, don't open your eyes. I could move. I wasn't paralyzed or anything. I was just comfortable. Then he said, I'm leaving. He says, but don't open your eyes. He says, I'll be leaving and just stay there and don't open your eyes. So I complied. I just laid there for 10, 15 minutes and I was sure he was gone. I really didn't want to see him, and I wanted to be sure he was gone. So then I got up. And now the sun's coming up. There's a ridge of mountains at the east of the missile complexes in the Minuteman area, and I could see the ocean. It was beautiful because the sun was just coming up and it kind of lit up the ocean. And then I looked down and I saw this little chipmunk, and I felt such a sense of love for that little chipmunk, like I was really connected to it. It was just like an epiphany, like, we're all here together. We're all living forms. And the little chipmunk looked at me and I looked at it and I got that feeling of connection and it just scurried away. And then probably 20 minutes, half hour later, my relief came. And now the memory is starting to fade, and I guess that's my suggestion. So the guard came down the little connection road. I went up. I could have, these were pickup trucks. They had a back seat to them with 4 doors. And I could have got inside, but I didn't want to. I got in the bed of the truck, and I just leaned against the cab, and I was well aware that something happened, but now the memory's fading, and I can't place it. Just awareness, something went on, but I didn't know what. And the other guards that were riding back there, they kept commenting how quiet it was, because usually that's a jovial time when everybody finally off duty, and now we're going to go back and get some breakfast, and there's some joking and talking, and I just sat there quiet, and they said, "What's wrong with you, Barth?" And I just, that's all right, just leave me alone, And
Sure. But the other people weren't in that same state of mind. So whatever happened likely just happened to you.
Yeah.
And
at least at that time, it could have happened to another guard. Roberts might have some other incidents that occurred at Vandenberg, but this was my night, I guess.
How much time do you think passed between when this being left and you see this chipmunk? Is it a matter of minutes, or is there some amount of time that passes?
Well, I lay there for about 10, 15 minutes. Then I got up, noticed how beautiful the scenery was with the ocean. It just impressed me. Then I saw that little chipmunk sitting there. So that was the time lapse between the time I lay there with my eyes shut and decided to get up. So 10, 15 minutes. It wasn't long after the being left.
And after the being left, did the thought come to you, I'm going to get on the phone and tell my superiors what occurred, or were you in such a state of shock that wasn't something that even...
shock. I was in a state of euphoria. I saw that little chipmunk. I love that little chipmunk. I couldn't explain how much I love that little chipmunk. I just felt deep, deep love for that little chipmunk. And I felt connected to it, like there's this spiritual connection between myself and this little chipmunk. It felt good. It just felt good and tired, really tired, exhausted.
It almost sort of sounds like after anesthesia from a surgery. You're euphoric, you're happy, feels like no time has gone by.
Yeah.
And then after some period of time, your memory of all of that experience. I mean, you certainly don't remember the surgery part.
No, I just felt tired, exhausted, couldn't quite remember what went on. And it kept, by the time I got in the truck, I really couldn't remember much of anything. I just was tired and exhausted, yet aware, what happened. Why do I feel this way? Something happened. I was aware something happened, but I couldn't detail it at all. Just knew something had happened. And so I just wanted to be by myself. I wanted to contemplate, why did I feel that way?
Now, 2 weeks later, the memory floods back all at once. What was that like, waking up and suddenly having the full experience return?
It was like watching a movie almost. From the time I saw the shadow and the coming out of the fog till the time I was on the floor of the guard shack looking at the little chipmunk, it played out like a movie in 3 sections. There was the section where the figure came to the guard shack, the inside the craft, and now laying back on the floor of the guard shack, seeing the chipmunk. That all just played right out in vivid detail. It wasn't like a dream state at all. It was very vivid. It was just, and I looked over at my roommate, because now I thought, oh God, something really happened. And I looked over at my roommate, and he was asleep, because I wanted to, right away, I wanted to say, hey, now I remember what happened back then. I always had this nagging feeling that something happened, but I couldn't remember what it was. But there was a nagging feeling, like ever since between the incident and the time I recalled it, there was this nagging feeling like something happened, but what? I didn't know. And then it was like, oh, this is what happened. And I wanted to tell my roommate right away. But he was asleep. So I got up and I got dressed, and when you're that age, breakfast is the paramount, one of the early things. And I was walking to breakfast, and I said, I got to tell somebody about this. I got to report this to higher authority. And then two things with me. One, I thought, no, they're going to think I'm crazy. How can I tell them? And then it was like, don't say, it was like I had a command. You're not going to tell anybody about this. You keep quiet. And so, and I felt that now that I was aware that something had happened and that they had some telepathy with me, I felt, okay, I'm going to listen. I'm hearing this or feeling this, or I'm not going to say anything. So I didn't. I just kept it to myself.
And for how long did you keep it to yourself?
Well, for a long time. First of all, when I was discharged, I had signed a non-disclosure agreement about anything I saw or heard on Vandenberg Air Force Base, and that had a 20-year window to it. And second, anytime I felt like I wanted to tell somebody, it was like I had a pre-command, no, don't say anything. Like I was hypnotized into not saying anything about it. And then I had the threat of a non-disclosure agreement, which can be jail time. So I just didn't say anything for 20 years and waited until that expired.
And go ahead.
No, it's just, that was it. I just waited 20 years. I was aware all the time. In fact, at that point, I started reading science, Isaac Asimov, which was good science fiction. Anything I could find on UFOs, I would look into and see if, try to find some sort of answer, because I full knowledge, from the time it came back to me, that stayed with me. It never went away. And that was very disturbing to have that in my background. And keeping it buried inside of me. It was so very interested. I didn't have real strong UFO feelings or sense of that before I went to that happened. I was aware of Betty and Barney Hill. I've read that, but I had no real thing about extraterrestrials. It wasn't something that really interested in me. Now I wanted to know everything about them, and so there was. Major Kehoe, he had published, I think, around that time. I read his book, and I wanted to know. I wanted to know what happened and who knew about it. And then Roswell came out. I think that was probably the first, public sense that there's other people of credibility that could come out with some information. And so I just carried it with me. That was all I could tell you. It wasn't comfortable carrying it with me, but I didn't want to tell anybody either.
Do you remember the first person that you actually told about all of this 20 years later?
Well, the first one I told in detail was my friend Lonnie, because she was she had a PhD in psychology, and she's actually regressive hypnosis was her specialty. And I actually thought maybe if I told her, she would want to do something to help me out, maybe regress me, but she kind of didn't want to. She just felt that it was not she did past life experience, but she wasn't into this type of thing. She just didn't feel qualified at the time. And but she believed me. I mean, she's very good at body language. She thought I was obviously quite disturbed when I was telling her about it. And she said, well, I could tell you're disturbed just talking to me. So she said, I believe something happened to you. And she was probably the first. And that happened not too long after Whitney Strieber wrote his book. I think that was one of the things that kind of, I read his Communion, I guess was the name of this book, and his experience was similar in terms of the entities that he claimed to have seen. And so I thought that brought it, like I wanted to tell somebody at that point after I read Whitney Strieber's book. So I told Lonnie, I don't know how much later that was, but it was somewhere in the 90s, early 90s, I guess. But
that had to be a real relief, I would think.
Oh, yeah, that was a great relief because, first of all, that Lonnie believed that she didn't go on to say that she believed my interpretation of the experience, but she believed that something definitely disturbing happened to me along the lines that I explained to her. She's a trained psychologist, so she's going to not jump to conclusions. She's just, accept that I have a story and that I believe my story. And because I believe my story, she's going to believe what I believe.
I want to talk about how the two of you found each other. So, Robert, before Richard tells us how he came to you, I want to hear your side. I understand you were being interviewed on Coast to Coast AM, which, of course, is one of the most listened to late night radio shows in America. When a caller came on the line, tell us about that.
I think Richard remembers it much better than I, but I think it was 2018. I was interviewed by George Norrie on Coast to Coast, and Richard indicated, I was just talking about my nuclear weapons related research involving military veterans and who had UFO experiences. And Richard apparently called in and was describing something that happened to him, this incident. But I don't have any clear memory of that, frankly. It's been too many years. So I'm 75 now. I'm starting to have memory issues. So that's about all I can contribute. So
I know that feeling. I'm a bit younger, but I can't remember what I did 2 days ago. So Richard, we'll hand it over to you. Tell us about you calling in to Coast.
Well, I listened to Coast if they had something I was interested in. When it came to UFOs, I would stay on the program. And then Robert Hastings came on. I didn't know him at the time, but he had mentioned Vandenberg, and I thought, well, he'd be interested. So I called in, and I started telling part of the story, and his comment, well, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Then he asked me the question. He says, well, do you recall having any lost time? And while I was answering that question, we were shut off the air. I mean, and I didn't know how to get back on at that point. And so, but the line was lost or shut down or whatever. And so I just let it go at that point. And so that would have been around 2018, I guess. But I was, having done that, having gone out public with that, now I started telling a few select friends that it had happened. That kind of set the pathway for me to tell somebody else at that time. So I started, after Coast to Coast, I started telling other people what had happened. And I told Lonnie before that, but that was a special situation because of her status. But I started telling friends. I didn't want the stigma. That's kind of weird to start telling your friends, oh, I was aboard a UFO. What are they going to think of you? And so but now I felt, I said it on Coast to Coast, and I might as well start telling people. So I did. And I started telling a few friends.
When do you decide to reach out to Robert?
Robert was being interviewed just not too long ago by Ross Coulthard. Yeah. Okay. I was watching, I watch a lot of YouTube, and I watch a lot of it. Comes back to UFOs. I'll watch that. And Robert was being interviewed, and so he gave his email address at the end of our website. I don't know. He gave a contact, some way to contact him. So I thought, well, he might be interested in this story. I didn't connect him with Coast to Coast in 2018. This was now. And so I contacted him, I think by email, and said I had this experience. And Robert said, well, can you write it up and send it to me? So I wrote it up and sent it to him in writing. And then he got back to me. And I said, well, this is fascinating. And it fit right into his research. And he had 168 cases, and I'd be 169. And he wanted to know more about what was going on, what my experience was.
And Robert, you did some vetting of Richard, correct? When he reaches out to you?
I always ask the veterans who I interview for their DD 214, which is their service record. It confirms basically when they were in the service and where they were stationed. So I can at least establish that. It's not going to go into any detail about any anomalous experiences they had. But Richard was proactive, and when he first contacted me via email, he did send me his DD 214 as an attachment. So he'd either heard me say that to Ross Coulthart that I do that, or he just took it upon himself thinking that I would probably ask him for it. So that's how we were introduced in October of 2025. And I was immediately impressed with the story. I contacted him by phone. We discussed it again and again, all sorts of details and so on. And I'm absolutely sure he's telling the truth. Of the 169 military veterans that I've interviewed, 8, Richard being the 8th, 8 of them have described being abducted by non-human entities in the course of the incident that they experienced involving nuclear weapons. And so, I'm so glad he's come forward. I think since I've ever interviewed. I find especially interesting the telepathic communication that he was receiving after coming back to the guard shack, where he was being told by this human-appearing entity that there were multiple races working together. And he describes this in detail in the written statement that he sent me. And what he was being told was, we value the Earth. We will not let humans destroy the Earth with a nuclear war. And if we have to, we will intervene. And he was further told that these entities, these races that are working together don't always agree or get along. So this is very intriguing information. As some of your viewers will know, I came out as an experiencer, as an abductee in 2019. I began investigating this in 1973 by seeking out and interviewing military personnel. And by 1981, I felt I had enough of a case for the reality of all of this, nuclear weapons being monitored and even interfered with by non-human entities aboard UFOs. I felt the public needed to know the facts, and I went out on the college lecture circuit and spoke at over 500 schools over a 36-year period, colleges and universities in the United States. But in 1988, August of 88, long story short, and we discussed this on my previous appearance with you, but I was abducted. That's the long and the short of it, with 2 other people. And eventually, over about a 20-year period, I had 5 more of these encounters that can only be described as alien abductions. And so I know the reality of it. I know the reality of telepathic communication. And I knew, having spent so many years trying to establish credibility for the nuclear weapons cases, I knew that if I suddenly went public with my face-to-face encounters with these entities, to say, in effect, I was an alien abductee, that I would lose a great deal of credibility in certain members of the public, large numbers probably, as well as the media. So I kept my mouth shut. I didn't talk about this until 2019, but it's real. It's part of the picture. And as I said, Richard is now the 8th Air Force veteran who's described the experience involving nuclear weapons, in his case, guarding a nuclear missile, unarmed nuclear missile, and also having an abduction. So it's part of the overall picture.
Now, Robert, in September of 1964 at Vandenberg, so Richard has his experience with these beings who tell him that they need data from this missile and will not allow nuclear war. As I understand it, that same month, Bob Jacobs, who's also been on our show, films a UAP shooting what appears to be a directed energy weapon or laser or something at a dummy nuclear warhead. And at the time, these 2 men didn't know each other. But am I correct that this was the same base, same month?
Same base, same month. And that was one of the intriguing things when Richard reached out to me. I went, holy cow, that's the same month that Bob Jacobs was engaged in or involved in the so-called Big Sur UFO incident. It's been very well publicized, but for what members of the audience that haven't heard about it, At that time, Lieutenant Bob Jacobs was the head of a photographic team tasked with, I should say, filming missile launches from Vandenberg, various missile tests out over the Pacific. And the remote telescope site was at Big Sur up on the California coast, about 100 miles northwest of Vandenberg. That site allowed missiles to be filmed from a side view as they were going out into space, and which is why they established that there. And I've established it was September 15th of 1964. They filmed this Atlas missile launch. The film was sent back to the base and developed. A day later, Lieutenant Jacobs got a call from a man named Major Florenz Mansman, who was the base photo analyst, who was analyzing the films and so on. And he said, "You need to come to my office once you're back on base." And when Lieutenant Jacobs showed up at Mansman's office, there were two men in gray suits standing there, or sitting there perhaps, and a movie projector, 16 millimeter movie projector was set up. And Mansman said, "Lieutenant Jacobs, watch this." And then they screened the film that had been shot a day, maybe it was 2 days prior. And Jacob sees this, the missile in the film frame, and the dummy warhead separates from it. The missile drops away. And as the warhead is flying downrange, and we've estimated it was about 400 miles from the telescope site, there was some trigonometry used to estimate these distances. While they're watching this dummy warhead flying in space, leaving Vandenberg, at this great distance, suddenly a disc-shaped object with a dome flew into camera frame and suddenly circled the warhead, and at 4 different junctures shot what looked like probably a plasma beam of light. Lasers can't be seen in space. So it had to be a plasma discharge of some kind, I'm guessing. And suddenly the warhead started tumbling after these 4 beams of light hit it. And Major Mansman said to Lieutenant Jacobs, "What were you guys screwing around up there?" And he said, "No, sir." And he said, "What do you think that is?" And he said, "It looks like we got a UFO on film." And Mansman said, "Lieutenant Jacobs, you're never to say that again." And he was dismissed. Now, what he didn't know until years later was those 2 men in gray suits were CIA officers. As soon as he left the office, the film was clipped out off the reel, the key footage, and confiscated by the CIA agents. And they told Major Mansman this was now top secret. Jacobs didn't have that information, and so in 1982, thinking that enough time had gone by, he wrote a magazine article about all of this, and suddenly he began getting death threats over the phone because of what had occurred. Now, the last thing I'll briefly mention, in 2023, Lou Elizondo, who I know, confirmed for me that when he was with ATIP, he watched the Big Sur film. It was on a DVD at that point. And he said it shows exactly what Bob Jacobs has claimed all these years that it showed, a UFO shooting down a dummy nuclear warhead.
Richard, tell us what that first meeting was what that was like with Bob Jacobs. When you call him up, or do you two meet in person? How does that happen?
Robert had given me Bob Jacobs as his email address, thinking he'd be interested because we were both at Vandenberg at the same time. So I contacted Robert. We got together on the telephone, and we had quite a conversation. That it was the same month, and so it could have been the same entities that were exploring the base at the particular time. I told him that I had a similar experience, but it was much later, probably May of 65, 8 or 9 months later. They were launching a Atlas missile, which would have been probably the same project that Robert was or Bob was photographing. But again, it was a warhead, dummy warhead that they were testing the configuration of down the Pacific test range. And from where I was standing, which was straight behind the missile, some distance away, and we're watching this missile, and this yellow orb comes over and starts tracking the missile. It didn't move around it or anything. It just stayed with the missile. But first of all, I thought I was going to have a fuel leak and it was going to blow up, but it didn't. And then the first stage dropped off and the yellow orb kept following it. So it couldn't have been a fuel leak. It had, I'm not sure what it was, but it wasn't a fuel leak and it was something that tracked this missile. Found out later that was not an uncommon occurrence to happen, that UFOs would come over and track these missiles during launch without intervening. So the next day, I was down at the launch site. That was my post the next day. And I asked the sergeant there, I said, what happened yesterday? He said, if I were you, I'd keep my mouth shut and not talk about that. So I kept my mouth shut and didn't talk about that one either.
Sure. Now, Robert, the message that Richard received, that these beings are gathering intelligence on our nuclear systems and intend to intervene, does that, if we were to go to nuclear war, does that align with other witnesses across your 200 plus cases that you've reported, that sort of message, a consistent message, it seems?
Well, the veterans that I've interviewed, of course, were at the field level. Very few, I can only think of a handful, were at the Pentagon. They were all in the field at missile sites or weapons storage areas. So they wouldn't have had that kind of information, but they've certainly speculated to me over the years that first what they saw was an extraterrestrial craft. And the working hypothesis, which I've shared since the 70s, is that this surveillance of our nuclear weapons and temporary interference from time to time by the UFOs shutting down or even activating our missiles and the Russians' missiles, which are incidents that are now documented and well established. I always consider that to be a warning of some kind or a threat, them wagging the finger at humans saying, do not use these weapons, get rid of the nuclear weapons. And what Richard, in essence, is confirming, he was telepathically told that they plan to intervene to prevent a major nuclear war. So, it just fits right in. And, it's just intriguing to me. And I do believe, as I said, I think Richard's absolutely on the level. So we've sort of got an inside glimpse, in effect, through his narrative of what many people, including myself, have speculated for decades about what's going on and what the motivation is behind the UFO activity at nuclear weapons sites.
Because we also have the Malmstrom cases. So Robert Salas, who's been on the show as well with Echo Flight, he had 10 Minuteman missiles going offline simultaneously. Richard's experience predates Malmstrom, I think, by about 3 years. So does that suggest there was kind of an escalation of their engagement, in your opinion, with nuclear weapons?
Yes, I think, it was just a pattern of activity that began with the missiles in the early 60s and continuing on through the decades, the 70s and 80s. Many of the interviewees, the veterans, have told me they were involved in incidents in the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s. So it's been an ongoing thing. Since you mentioned Bob Salas, I earlier mentioned that 8 of the veterans whom I've interviewed have said that they are also abductees. Many people don't know that Bob Salas came out in 2013 and said that many years after his incident at Malmstrom in 1967, he was in bed with his wife in 1985 at their home in California, and suddenly the room filled with a blue light, and he sat up and saw a small figure enter the room, and he was about to react and suddenly was paralyzed. And he remembered that much. He ultimately had hypnosis done where he apparently was taken by multiple entities who had come into his bedroom, taken through a closed window, which is one of the elements that many abductees describe, being taken through closed doors and windows. I myself was taken through a ceiling, but that's another story. And Salas describes going on board a craft, which interestingly, one of the things he described about the craft was he at one point was examined by what he called gray entities. And then following that, he was led to a corridor and sat down on a bench. And the bench, according to Bob Salas, was molded right into the wall, just exactly how Richard is describing.
Wow.
And so, anyway, whether, the abduction phenomenon is very controversial, but it's real. I can tell you it's real. Richard can tell you it's real. Some small percentage of the military veterans that I've interviewed, again, to be redundant, have described being abducted as well. So it's part of the overall picture, whether people want to believe it or not.
I wonder sometimes, this seems to be a thread in abduction stories that I hear, that that they kind of apologize after the fact. So maybe they insert something into their nose and you experience a lot of pain and they're like, oh, sorry, we didn't mean to do that. And then everything's okay. Or in this instance, this being terrifies Richard and then at the end apologizes for it. You would think that these entities would know ahead of time how it's going to go, that they're going to terrify the people, that if they stick something, a probe up their nose or whatever to put in an implant, that it's going to cause pain. I sometimes wonder if it's intentional. The fear and the trauma is a necessary sort of part of the experience. Is that something that's ever crossed your mind?
Relating to my own experiences, my memories of them are fragmentary. However, I do recall on more than one occasion interacting with one or more of what we would call grays. And the impression I had was basically they were just going about their business. They had a task to do. They were going to do it. They didn't really care whether I was being traumatized or whatever. But the handful of telepathic messages that I recall receiving during those incidents, some requiring hypnosis, others I had ready recollections of suddenly, for example, being in a hotel room and having suddenly a distinct impression that they were there, even though I couldn't see them or sense them. But the message I had in my mind was, we are here for you. You have met us before. And then the abduction process began. So it's just very businesslike, very straightforward, no nonsense, not a lot of elaboration of any kind. I don't recall ever being apologized to for the trauma they imposed on me. But so I think there's a variety of experiences within subsets of experiences within the overall experience. Not everybody's reporting the same kind of thing.
Richard, we spoke earlier about Bob Jacobs. Robert spoke about that, the threats and whatnot that Bob Jacobs underwent. His mailbox was bombed. I mean, it was just horrible. I'm curious, since you have gone public, have you had any kind of harassment or odd phone calls or anything like that?
No, nothing.
Okay, good.
Maybe it's probably, I don't know, because I was almost expecting something, but
Sure.
so when I went public with Robert, but so far nothing's happened.
Let me interject something there. When I tried to put him in touch with, when I tried to put Bob Jacobs and Bob Salas in touch with Richard, they told me that they emailed him multiple times, and at that point he had not received their emails. So apparently their emails were being intercepted. So I conveyed that to Richard. I've had problems like that for decades, so it was no surprise. But anyway, once I learned that they had attempted to reach him and someone was preventing their emails reaching him, I got them together by telephone, and so we moved ahead from that point.
Robert, between 2003 and 2005, 5 separate UAP incidents at Vandenberg that we know of, a triangular craft larger than a football field, a glowing red square over missile defense sites. I mean, this seems to be like over 40 years after Richard's experience that this kind of stuff is happening. What does that persistence of activity sort of tell you?
Not knowing the answer to that, really, all I can say is that whatever we're doing in the way of possessing and threatening to use nuclear weapons, Vladimir Putin is threatening to use his nuclear weapons. Whoever they are in these craft, they're still monitoring the situation one way or another. They're still showing up at various missile bases and other facilities relating to nuclear weapons. The thing has to be emphasized. I'm sure I know 1% of the number of cases that have occurred over the years. I mean, when I track down a veteran, if I've heard something that they were involved in, or they approach me, as Richard did, it's catch as catch can. There's no systematic way of investigating every site, every incident, rather, that's occurred at every base chronologically over the years. I'm sure there's a great many more cases than I will ever know about, but it's ongoing. Obviously, whatever we're up to, the entities are still keeping an eye on us, and from time to time, I'm sure still interfering with the weapons. Other than the three people who've contacted me, including Richard, in the last year, there was a several-year gap where I didn't seek anyone out and no one approached me. So I'm sure things went on over the last decade that I would never know about.
Now, Robert, the UAP Disclosure Act has now been blocked twice from the NDAA in the FY 2026 defense bill. As I understand from Congressman Eric Burleson, they're still trying to kind of resuscitate the whole thing. And I'm curious, how important do you think, especially given Richard's story and what you've heard from so many of these other Air Force personnel that dealt with the nation's nuclear weapons, how important do you think it is for Congress to address the fact that UAP are clearly tampering with our nuclear deterrent? And if a member of Congress happens to be watching this show now, what would be your message to that person?
Well, obviously, it's a real situation. It's an ongoing situation. I think it's self-evidently important that Congress investigate all of this as much as possible. But realistically, I know the history of in particular, CIA's influence on Congress in terms of suppressing this information over the years. I don't think that's changed. I think behind the scenes, the people who have harassed Dave Grush, for example, after he's testified about the very dramatic things he knew about, there are people within government now that don't want this to happen. They're postponing the inevitable, in my opinion. I think they have a certain degree of influence, probably a great degree of influence on Congress. And so I don't think any of us should really expect a dramatic breakthrough anytime soon. On the other hand, Trump is so unorthodox in the way he approaches things. If anything's going to suddenly break open and there's going to be any kind of public acknowledgement of the reality of UAPs and NHIs, it could be Trump who does it, but who knows? I'm just speculating, obviously.
Richard, you've kept this story to yourself for the better part of 60 years. You've now told it publicly. What do you want people to take away from what happened to you on that foggy morning in 1964?
Well, it's my particular incident, just another piece to the puzzle. It's incident number 169 in Robert's research. And, one of the big problems that I can't verify what I can only go by my character. And I think I've had pretty good character. I've been a registered nurse for over 40 years. I was taught the nursing at the college level. So most of my friends, and Robert and his vetting have contacted several of my friends that will vouch that I'm a pretty honest guy, that I'm not inclined to make up stories. But the problem is I can't verify that this actually happened to me. And so I just want it to be part of the big picture. If they can just, I was thinking the other day with AI, artificial intelligence, they need to feed all these stories into one AI program and find the similarities and come up with a more complete picture. And I'm sure now that we have that capability, I think that's something that needs to be done. Mine will just be one piece of the puzzle. That's all I expect it to be. But it's an important piece, in my mind, an important piece of the puzzle. I was very aware of Robert Salas's incident occurred 3 years after mine, and I did get hold of him, thanks to Bob, or Robert, and we had a little talk on that, and it just all fits together. And I think between all the stories out there, there's a lot that are not credible that need to be thrown up, but there's a link. And I think AI will establish that link and come up with a very accurate picture of what's really going on. And that may be outside of Congress or outside the government, because that can be done by private corporation or private. It'd be interesting if we can just collate all this information and come up with a big picture.
I think it's just a matter of time. I read recently that the current models of AI were actually written by the previous model of AI. So AI is writing the next version in full without a human sitting there programming it. So if it's doing that, that wouldn't surprise me at all. So Robert, what is next for you, and where can people find your books?
My first book, UFOs and Nukes, is available at Amazon, as is the second book that I co-wrote with Bob Jacobs, where we came out as experiencers. That's called Confession. I'm just playing it by ear day to day. I'm trying to work on a third book that deals with non-human entity contact with humans. It's slow going, but we'll see. That's my main project for 2026, to try to get this book done.
Awesome. Well, thanks to you both for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Richard, so nice to meet you. Robert, always good to see you and hear what you're up to. This has just really been fantastic. I appreciate really the bravery of you both. This is certainly not an easy topic to talk about without some kind of negative consequence, it seems. So especially you, Robert, I've told many a friend this, that I do not think we would be where we are at in this disclosure conversation had it not been for your work. So my hat is off to both of you. And Richard, thank you, sir, for your service, and look forward to having you both back on the show at some point.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.